Welcome to You and Your Democracy. It's a short take civics lesson as part of our program, Where Do We Go From Here? I'm Chuck Parkinson. Each episode, we will look at the head and heart of democracy. We will explore the values and the principles that have created our American exceptionalism and examine the structures and institutions that give us the guardrails of our democratic republic. To quote Benjamin Franklin when asked in 1787 after the Constitutional Convention, "Doctor, what have we got, a republic or monarchy?" To which Franklin responded with a rejoinder at once witty and ominous, "A republic if you can keep it." So now let's take a look at what is this great American experiment, and then ask, what do we need to do to keep it? In today's episode, we will look at what are our rights and responsibilities as Americans. I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. John Van Benthuysen, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Black Hills State University. Thanks for joining us today, John.
It's good to be with you again, Chuck.
Let's just jump right in if we can. Understanding rights and responsibilities, why is it important?
Well, I think the answer to this question can be found in our founding documents, and specifically in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the U.S. Constitution. So these amendments are critical to outlining the freedoms and responsibilities of every American citizen, and they outline what political scientists sometimes refer to as negative and positive freedoms. And so, what do we mean by this distinction? When we're talking about negative freedoms, we're really talking about the freedom from external restraint on our actions. In short, the freedom from government. And so, a good example of this negative freedom outlined in the Bill of Rights is the Fourth Amendment, which secures the rights of individuals, against unreasonable searches and seizures without probable cause and a warrant. This is kind of a classic example of freedom from government. Alternatively, when we're talking about positive freedoms, this is really referring to, you know, the capacity to act in one's own will, basically, right? To take action and to shape your own destiny. And I think the best example of positive freedom outlined in the Bill of Rights is found in the First Amendment. And this is the amendment that secures individual rights to speak their conscience freely, to assemble with their fellow citizens, and to petition government against redress of grievances, amongst other things, right? So this is a great example of freedom to shape your destiny, and that's why it's considered positive. It's active as opposed to kind of reactive. Now, I think in an ideal scenario, these negative and positive freedoms should be in balance, and when they are in balance, this helps secure the health of a democratic system. Today, unfortunately, in the United States, I think we're in danger of having these rights or freedoms, if you will, out of balance. And I think that increasingly Americans seem to be privileging their negative freedoms, their freedom from government. And we see this in all types of areas. Perhaps most prominently, we see the privileging of negative freedom in low participation rates in elections. It's obvious in national elections, but it goes all the way down to state and local elections as well. Freedom from participating from the democratic process, basically, right? Now, I think more insidiously, we see this kind of, this desire to kind of be relieved of our obligations and informing ourselves adequately. And I think that we sometimes maybe don't appreciate fully how essential this is to maintaining a democratic system. It's a responsibility for all Americans to be adequately informed, and this allows us to make informed decisions, to select candidates that are going to adequately represent our interests in the halls of government. I think too frequently today, Americans are kind of falling down in this regard of, informing themselves adequately by walling themselves off into extreme partisan echo chambers, whether on social media, cable news, talk radio, you name it. The emphasis seems to be more on either disconnecting and focusing on entertainment, or kind of seeking shelter within these partisan echo chambers, and that's not good for the health and maintaining a vibrant democratic society.
Very true from that standpoint. It's often a point where we look at the fact that rights are on one hand and responsibilities are on the other hand. But the thing you touched on is the voting is a right and a responsibility, and to be informed is, the ultimate test for somebody to show their responsibility when they cast that, have that right to cast that vote.
I couldn't agree more. And so this kind of raises questions, what can be done to kind of facilitate not only greater engagement with the democratic process, obviously in elections, but also, how can we cultivate an environment where the majority of Americans are doing their due diligence on informing themselves about issues and about candidates. And I think we're kind of struggling to kind of find that answer.
Do you think that's been the case as we look back through history? There have been other occasions from that standpoint. There have been deep partisan divides, or not necessarily from a individual political perspective, but more from an issues perspective. You take the run up to the Civil War or other activities that have taken place, but where we've reached now, as a political scientist, when you look back and look at, as you are examining and and preparing instruction for your students, how do you come across and how do you address these things, and how should they address these
Well, it's interesting. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes. And so we have this intense media environment, this polarized media environment today. And I think, Americans who lived during the 1950s and 1960s, or at least during that media environment, it wasn't nearly as partisan as it was. And so uh, usually people kind of look at the environment, the polarized environment we have today, and think that it's not normal or that it's a departure. But that's not necessarily the case. If you look at the American media environment, especially in the 19th century, it was as hyper partisan, frankly, as it is today. It was not unusual for parties to have their own kind of local newspapers that would just stick to the party line, or even candidates, individual candidates, to have papers that were kind of exclusively backing their worldview. I think of Andrew Jackson, who had a lot of prominent papers in Tennessee, who were proud of their native son and also advancing his agenda. And so it's not unusual today that we have a partisan media environment, but it is different, right? And so, at least back then, people had to engage with reading, and now it's much more passive. And I worry about that difference.
Excuse me, that's a very good point on that difference from that standpoint. And as we take a look and run up to the current election, the rhetoric and it becomes a real responsibility of individuals, as you talked about, to educate themselves on issues, on candidates, and everything else, and and really take the steps necessarily to see all positions, to at least examine those, or to listen to others rather than just say this is my way or the highway, and this is the only way I'm going to be that way. To kind of work our way back to the middle to how we make that approach to become an educated voter.
And what you're talking about is a skill, which means that it is something that has to be taught. And this gives us a clue on how we can go about kind of cultivating this perspective amongst citizens, right? I think that this is something that has to be taught at an early age in public education. We need to kind of raise awareness about media literacy. We can't just kind of have an approach where we just kind of leave individuals to kind of figure things out entirely by themselves. That may work for some people, but I think if we want to have a democratic society where the vast majority of people are taking this seriously and informing themselves, this is a skill that has to be taught. And where do we learn? Typically, it's in school.
Yeah, I think that's one thing. As the technology has evolved, even over the last 20 years, which had so many platforms and so many different points of view that are rather radical. And it's not, like you pointed out, not new, because you look back at the 19th century, the newspapers were incredibly radical at that particular time on for candidates on both sides of issues. And as you talk about the education for being able for individuals to discern what is truth and what isn't truth, And you can still have your opinions about things from that standpoint, but to be able to look at what's real and what's not real.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to remember, a quote from Neil deGrasse Tyson that, the universe is under no obligation to make sense to you. And it's really incumbent upon the individual to really struggle with the complexity of our world because, things are complex. I think we desire things to be kind of simple, black and white, good or bad. But the fact is, life is not that simple, unfortunately.
Yeah,
We
life
really
is a
do
lot
have
more
to struggle.
lot more complex than we would like it to be. If there were simple answers, there would be no problems. Is that the adage that often comes to mind from that perspective? We could certainly go on for a long, long time on this topic, and some of the things we brought up today will certainly be issues we can talk about in the future, hopefully. As we get ready to leave, is there one thing that you would like to leave that you think is really important for the people who will tune into this program?
Well, when we're talking about the importance of informed decision making, I always like to think of Thomas Jefferson, who was very witty, had a lot of great quotes, and one in particular that I think is for our time in particular is in a letter that he wrote to a friend. If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, they are expecting what never was and never will be.
That's a good point to end on and food for thought for the future. That's our episode for now. I want to thank Dr. John Van Benthuysen for sharing his expertise and thoughts with us today. And as always, our executive producer, Suzanne Stratford, and the SDPB technical staff for their creativity and hard work on this program. Thank you also to the supporters of South Dakota Public Broadcasting who make this program possible. To view previous episodes in this series, go to sdpb.org/election. If you have comments or suggestions for future episodes, send us a note at programming@sdpb.org. Until our next short take, I'm Chuck Hartmanson.